Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional league, Dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am their host, Ethan Orfe. This week has been pretty interesting, man, as far as football matchups. We're almost there at the college football playoffs. We're into the next round of the NFL. Sports is just taking over right now. NBA is getting hot, close to the All-Star break. Zion might be coming back soon. You know, just sports are taking over, man. Got some good stuff for you guys today. One of those things is some good news on my behalf. I won in FanDuel yesterday, or not yesterday, but last week. I won one of the entry level, money buy-ins for fantasy. Put in $2, won $2 back. It was great. I won $4, so I made $2 profit. So I definitely will be playing again. As I do most weeks. Most weeks I don't win though, because it's probably easier to break even this time around, just because the playoffs, there's not that many teams. So you play usually, one day out of the two, and you just kind of have to pick and choose which players you think are going to be dominant and which ones aren't. It really boils down to who's going to have that X Factor game, as we're going to talk about people and their X Factor abilities later on in the podcast. But, yeah, man, won some money, living good. So let's go ahead and live better by getting into these playoff matchups. So we're going to look first at the Texans versus Kansas City matchup from a fantasy perspective, just because we want to look at some players that may have a good game or have the potential to have a good game. And I'd like to start off with the Texans. Their players who I think might have a chance. Of course, Deshaun Watson. He's always up for a big game. He's their quarterback. He can do amazing things, as he did last weekend against the Bills. Just doing things that you just don't see in the league from many players. So he is obviously a player that can go get you some big time points, can go get in the end zone, and he's a gamer. He likes to try and win. So you're never really out of it if you have Deshaun Watson, and if you had him in your fantasy league this year, you kind of know he's as consistent as they come when it comes to giving you some decent fantasy points. So if you wanted to pick him up in FanDuel or DraftKings, that wouldn't be a bad pickup. One of their skill position players, of course, is DeAndre Hopkins. Hopkins had a weird game last Saturday where the first half he was kind of a non-factor as far as just points and fantasy-wise. Of course, he always has a factor on the field when it comes to making defenses play different coverages and how to guard him. However, from the points value, he didn't get really any points in the first half, and then he exploded in the second half and helped that team secure the playoff win. So I'll be looking for him to have a big impact as well. Someone who won't be playing, or at least we don't know. We really don't know what Will Fuller's status is. So Kenny Stills, we don't know either. But Will Fuller, a big portion of their offense, we don't know what's going to happen with that, if he's going to play or if he can play. I'm sure if it was up to him, he probably would like to play. I'm not sure how he's doing. There's just really been no update on that as of yet. So we'll just wait and see. Usually Wednesday and Thursday practices usually tell you if a player will be kind of good to go, and we just haven't had any updates on the Will Fuller scene. So we're going to look at the Houston running backs to kind of help Deshaun out in the run game, because to be frank, Deshaun did a lot of running on Saturday, and I'm not sure if that's the key to victory for them. Granted, he was throwing in the pocket for quite some time, and Houston hasn't really been able to protect Deshaun Watson as much. He got sacked 7 times last week, and the Chiefs defense is no slouch either. So we really have to see what they're able to do as far as protection schemes, and if Laramie Tunsil can get it together and play like the level we expect from him and how he should be able to play. But it's going to be a tough matchup because you're going against a front seven of the Chiefs that are starting to get the ball rolling as far as getting pressure and getting sacks, and it's making it easier on that secondary to get more consistent stops. So looking at players like Chris Jones on that defense is going to be big, because Chris Jones is one of the best defensive tackles in the National Football League, if not the best. And he's a force. He can draw doubles like any other player in the league, and he really just gets, he takes that team to a different level, and they really missed him when he was out for a few weeks, and their team started to kind of skid in a different direction. But now they're riding the ship, and they got really hot near the end, and they ended up getting the bye, so they didn't play last week. But it's hard for me to not think that Andy Reid doesn't have this team prepared to go out there and battle for this playoff win. Of course, Patrick Mahomes, one of the best quarterbacks in the league, one of the best quarterbacks in fantasy period, even though he had a weird year fantasy-wise. He got hurt. He wasn't as explosive as he was last year, which, to be honest, isn't fair to say to him. It's so hard to be that consistently off the charts. There's not that many athletes in the world who are just day in and day out just that good. Patrick Mahomes was playing at a level that I don't think he'll ever get to again. That's like the lightning in the bottle level that some quarterbacks can get to for like a year. And that might have been one of those years. Like the year that Aaron Rodgers won MVP, that was insane. The year that Drew Brees won the Super Bowl, an insane offensive year. Lamar's having one of those insane offensive years, or the Ravens offense in general is having one of those incredible offensive displays right now. So, you just kind of have to take those as they are, and there are more outliers than they are commonalities. But we do know he's an excellent quarterback, a good football player, great fantasy person to own and to use if you're using daily fantasies. So he is one guy, and of course, you never really know what you're going to get from Chiefs players because they spread the ball around pretty well. So you don't really know what their skill positions are going to look like as far as the fantasy points are concerned. But one guy that I know I owned him in fantasy, and he just seems to have a nose for the football, is Travis Kelce, their big tight end. And I mean humongous. He has the skill set of a wide receiver, but he's just humongous. He's going to be a really, really big asset to them in the passing game and being able to really take top off the defense because he's so fast. He's very quick to be that big, and no linebacker can really cover him. Safeties have a hard time taking him down because he's so huge. And linebackers can't. His speed just kind of takes them out of the game too. So Travis Kelce, I look to see him get in the end zone a few times. Definitely if they get into that threshold of the red zone where he can really do his best damage. And then, of course, the deep ball threat, the best deep ball threat in football is Tyreek Hill, and he's always a threat. No matter how far the ball is, if he can get open, you got to chuck it to him. At least Patrick Mahomes has the skill to chuck it to him because his arm is a legitimate cannon. So looking at that, you really have to just expect a really big shootout. I'm expecting a shootout. I don't think Kansas City's defense is going to is going to be as shut down as they have been in the past few weeks. I think it's still pretty good. It's definitely found its stride, but it's still not the best. And Deshaun Watson does his magic when the cards are against him the most. And I don't think anybody's taking the Texans here. And he's probably going to surprise some people because people have been doubting him ever since he got drafted. And he just holds that chip on his shoulder. So I wouldn't be surprised if this game turns into a bit of a shootout, but I do expect the Chiefs to pull this one out just because they just have so much talent across the board. All right, so coming up after this break, we're going to get into another playoff matchup and looking at their fantasy projections and possibilities and if there's any injuries and stuff like that. And that's coming right up.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, so last time we talked about the Texans and the Kansas City Chiefs, and now we're going to get into the other AFC playoff matchup, the Tennessee Crimson Tide versus the Baltimore Ravens. And I'm just kind of just joking around there. Of course, it's the Tennessee Titans. They are a full team, even though on Saturday night, they displayed a running game akin to Derrick Henry's pleasing and liking, a la Crimson Tide-esque, a la his high school team-esque. Did you know he broke the high school rushing record with he rushed for 4,000 yards? That's it's unreal what he is. They waited 2 years to utilize him this way. I guess they had to build in the draft and get the players to be able to run the football this well, but he's just a truckload. And Derrick Henry is a guy where he just gets better as the game goes on. He just runs it makes him mad each time he gets the ball more. So he runs even harder than the last time. And he wears you out. He's like 6'3", 250. That's a linebacker. A linebacker running in between the tackles, runs a 4.4, just galloping down the field. Honestly, it's hard for me to say that he's not an instant pick for fantasy, just because that game, the whole game plan revolves around that young man. Now, I will say that there's no way the Ravens aren't going to try and key in to stop him. It's just a matter of if they can. If that Ravens defense can stop the run game as much as the Patriots could. And the Patriots actually weren't that good of a run defense. And there's a stat floating around about the Ravens being really good against outside runs this year. And that's been Derrick Henry's bread and butter this year. So it's going to be an interesting matchup to see just what happens in between the trenches and just see if Derrick Henry can continue on this amazing run that he's had this season rushing the football. Of course, another player on the Tennessee offensive side of the ball that might be an interesting little pickup is A.J. Brown, just because last week he didn't really have much going on for him. But there's just no way that he will be. Well, the Patriots secondary is really good. The Ravens secondary is pretty good too. However, there's always it's not as knit tight as New England's. And also, when you commit to the run so much, there's going to be openings at some point. And he is their deep threat. He's tall, fast, has good hands, and just has a nose for the football. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I would put some money down on him getting at least 6 catches. I think he would see six targets, and he might come down with a deep ball here or there, and maybe he gets an end zone touchdown just to put icing on the cake. If you wanted to get a little frisky and see if you wanted to save some money, maybe a Dion Lewis pickup, just because they may utilize him a bit more in the passing game if the Ravens, which I expect this to happen, if the Ravens get up at least on a 2-score lead, the Titans' whole strategy goes out the window as far as running the football, or at least eating so much clock running the football. They're going to have to pass, and that means Tannehill's going to have to throw the football. And if they take away A.J. Brown, if they take away their other receivers and their tight end, more checkdowns and more opportunities for Dion Lewis in the passing game might be something that you want to be looking at as far as just a more of a budget fantasy option. He's definitely one of those, he's better suited for one of those third down, catch up the backfield, flat route type of running backs, and he can make somebody miss, and he might be able to turn it up for a good amount of yards and some gains. So that might be somebody you want to take your chance to look at. On the Ravens side of the ball for offense, of course, Lamar Jackson is going to be the most expensive fantasy player to pick up this week, as he has been for a majority of the season. So that's not going to change. The offense is tailor-made. There's been a little bit of how Lamar is going to do in his second playoff game ever, and I think he'll be fine. It's not like he's getting thrown into the wolves. It's the same system. It'll be the same way they've handled playing a game every week. So we'll just see what happens. But I expect him to be as awesome as he has been all season long. Their tight end, Mark Andrews, is a huge point of their offense. He might be their best receiver as far as, or his number one target in the passing game. So Mark Andrews is definitely might be a nice tandem pickup between him and Lamar. And he definitely had one of his better games near the end of the season anyway. Mark Andrews is a really good quality tight end and one of the best left in the playoffs for sure. The big question mark is if Mark Ingram is going to play. He stated to be probable. So you might be wary, and you may want to pick up Gus Johnson, because Gus Johnson might be the one that takes more carries than him. I don't think he'll be on a pitch count, Mark Ingram, that is. However, I don't think he'll be carrying the ball as much as you would expect him to in a playoff scenario, just because they probably think that this game, not that I think it's an easy game, because Tennessee definitely isn't an easy team to beat. They beat you up. They run you to the ground, literally. But if they can get some scores up early and force Tennessee to have to throw the ball down the field, that's when you get them at their weakest point. And Baltimore hasn't had really any problems scoring the football really all season. So, like I've been alluding to, I really don't think that Tennessee can stay in this game unless they have just superb clock control or time of possession, timeout management. They're going to have to outcoach Baltimore, and they just have to keep the ball out of Lamar's hands for as long as humanly possible. And they have to make every single possession count. And this isn't like the cliche, like, of course, you want to make every possession count. You want to score every chance you can get. But this is a game of, the law of averages. You can't let Lamar touch the ball X amount of times and not expect him to come away with points, at least 3. At this point in the season, just the way you know how this team gets, how they get on a roll. and how they can score down the field really effortlessly. Just the way their offense is predicated on just utilizing all different forms of, they're just fast and athletic all over the place. And Tennessee's defense is just not that good. They're good enough to get here. They're good enough to stop the Patriots on the goal line stand that basically won them the game in a sense. However, they're still not that good. They wouldn't be able to keep up with a Kansas City, and they definitely won't be able to keep up with a Baltimore Ravens offense. So it's really up to Tennessee's offense to do what they need to do. They need to set the tone, make sure that they get Derrick Henry going early, and they need to score. If they don't score on their first possession, it's going to be a long game for Derrick Henry and the crew, just because it's just going to be a uphill battle from that point on. Because if Lamar goes up 14 or 10-0, that's and they like everything depends on the next possession for Tennessee. It won't get ugly, but it definitely won't get pretty for them. It'll be a tough scenario for that Tennessee team. So I wouldn't put my money on Tennessee winning. This is the matchup with the Patriots was interesting just because we knew the Patriots they had a ceiling at this point, and we kind of knew where it was, and their offense just couldn't break past that. So it was really appetizing to look at a Tennessee team that really could take the Patriots on and give them a good run for their money. And they did more than that. They took the money. So this time around, I just don't think they have enough firepower. And I don't trust Tannehill in this sort of scenario to really sling that football around and go in a shootout with Lamar Jackson. All right. So coming up after this next break, we're going to get into the NFC playoff games and their fantasy matchups. Coming right up.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, so the next playoff matchup I'm going to be discussing is the Minnesota Vikings versus the San Francisco 49ers. So, we all saw the biggest upset since the last biggest upset in playoff history, which was the underdog scenario that the Vikings were in. They were 8-point underdogs and they beat the Saints in overtime. Great game to watch. It was a fun game. And now they're going to go up against a team in the 49ers who haven't played in a week. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Teams need rest. I'm sure they've been scouting, and Kyle Shanahan will have that team prepared to go up against this team. But at the same time, maybe this is what Minnesota wants. You know, everybody wants to get the bye, because it gives you a chance to rest up. You have a higher % chance of winning and going to the Super Bowl because you have one less game to play. But Minnesota might be one of those teams that has, they caught that magic, that fire. Kirk Cousins won his first playoff game, and it was in pretty clutch fashion as well. And it might have quieted down the naysayers. It definitely it's kept me a little bit quiet about him. I still don't trust him fully in bigger game scenarios and scenarios where he really has to throw the football, because the Saints offense was just abysmal last Sunday. So it didn't really push Kirk Cousins to another level of having to play. It was just more, they just played a better game than the Saints, all in all. And Kirk Cousins just looked comfortable the whole game for the most part. And the 49ers are notorious for making people uncomfortable this season as far as the quarterbacking group. They can really, well, in the early part of the season, they were getting after the quarterback, but they're just not doing it as much this back half, and that's just due to injuries, and they're just not the same front seven as they were. However, they still make it tough for opposing quarterbacks and opposing offenses, and they're one of the better defenses left in the playoffs. So, what does that mean for Minnesota's offense? Not much, really, as far as what the scheme is, what the goal is, what's the plan. The plan should be to give Dalvin Cook the ball as many times as he pleases to get the ball. Dalvin Cook, since coming back, is still the same old Dalvin Cook before he left. And Minnesota was a whole different team when he did leave against Green Bay. Or by leave, I mean he was not able to play. When they started him at Green Bay, didn't play, and that team was not the team that we saw on Sunday. Dalvin Cook just makes people miss, is able to break tackles, he's strong. He's just a good run finisher. He finishes runs hard. Like, he just doesn't go down easy. So that's going to be a key factor for that team to really make some noise in this playoff matchup, and to keep the game involved, like keep their momentum and keep the game at their own pace. So you need him to really get going, so that way Kirk Cousins doesn't have to make many plays. Now, there's nothing wrong with Kirk Cousins as a quarterback, really. He's fairly good. The issue is there are playmakers and there are game managers, if you want to be the cliche quarterback comparisons, and he is not really a playmaker per se. He can make plays, but if you need him to continuously make plays for you, he's not the quarterback for you. That's just not what he's built on. It hasn't been what he's built on beforehand. But everything around him is so good, is that if the perfect scenario works out, or he's in a good position, then Kirk Cousins is a fine quarterback to have, and he's good enough to take you places. And the two receivers on the outside are really good, and their tight end is really good as well. So Adam Thielen had a big catch in overtime against the Saints. And it just goes to show you that even though he kind of struggled in the beginning of that game, he can always turn it on and get it going. And he can look like the playmaker that we saw from a year ago, where he looked like he was the best wide receiver on that roster and one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, period. And then on the other side, of course, is Stephon Diggs, who was not seeing a lot of targets in that game. However, when he did get the ball, he did make some really big time catches. And we know throughout the season, he was really, really keen. He had a good connection with Kirk Cousins this season, and it looks like he made it to a new level of playing, really, for him. He looked like he really ascended to a different tier of the wide receiver groups. I look for him to have a big impact on the game and see what he is able to do on the offensive end. And of course, the Kyle Rudolph, who scored the game winner, the walk-off in overtime. He's just huge, a big target, I should say. He's not a wide receiver. He's definitely a tight end. He can block pretty well. Not as good as he used to, but he still is a good blocker. But his size and ability to catch in the passing game has always been really good on the Vikings, and now it just helps Kirk Cousins even more to have somebody who honestly looks like he trusts him. As in, Rudolph trusts Kirk Cousins to get him the ball when he needs to get there and to make the right play at the right time and make the right call. So the 49ers, on the other hand, I'm not a fan of their quarterback either. Yeah, I'm not a big Jimmy Garoppolo guy. I just don't think he's that good. I think he's serviceable. I think he's all right. I just don't think he's the guy that his record makes him say he might be. Like, he's won a lot of games, but I don't know if that's because he's that good. But the pieces around him are pretty good. So one of those pieces that happens to be is one of the better tight ends in the league, if not the best tight end in National Football League, who is George Kittle. George Kittle is a phenomenal player, and he just racks up targets, racks up catches, and he just doesn't go down. He just doesn't believe you can tackle him. He has, I remember, one of those, I think it was against the Saints, where he just bullied a cornerback. That's what that's what won the game, actually, I remember correctly. He's just bigger than everybody. He's like the kid in the backyard who is he's like the 8th grader that's playing with a bunch of 5th graders, but he's the older brother of all the 5th graders. And he still wants to play with everybody because he doesn't want to sit at home and do nothing. So he just plays football with them in the backyard and just bullies them down. And it's not fair because your team got the lowest end of the draw to get him on your team. So now he's just catching everything, pushing people down, doing weird touchdown celebrations near the trash can. He's just a bully on the football field, and having someone like him as a huge target is paramount to try and take away that pass rush that was on full display for the Vikings last weekend. And their offensive line is pretty good too. And if you can keep Garoppolo clean, he might be able to get the ball down the field. You know, of course, the pickup mid-season for Emmanuel Sanders was a really, really good pickup for a lot of reasons. And one of those reasons is it kept some teams from really improving their offense in total. So someone like the Saints, who were looking for a second wide receiver, someone like the Patriots, who needed a receiver, period. They just fortified their chances of really making a really good run at this thing. And it really looks like the 49ers are in peak position to really take control of the NFC, just because their defense is really good and their offense is good enough to get them through it all. So with that said, we're going to take another quick break, and then after that, we're going to talk about the last NFC playoff matchup, and that's coming right up.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
All right, the last matchup of the playoffs will be Seattle versus Green Bay, at least the ones that we're going to talk about. So, fantasy players from Seattle, who to watch? Because we watched Seattle last time. They went against the Eagles squad that was quite undermanned and became even more undermanned as Carson Wentz went down with the head injury. It was definitely not a good thing to see. You hate to see stuff like that, especially with someone with, Carson has an injury history, but a head injury is not really typical. And of course, he got body slammed in the ground, in the turf, and helmet to helmet collided. So it's just a tough thing for him. On the other side, the Seahawks did what they needed to do to get to the next round. Russell Wilson is still Russell Wilson, so he is able to make And he's one of those guys like Deshaun Watson, or maybe Deshaun Watson is like Russell Wilson, since Russell Wilson was in the league before Deshaun, but the out of pocket mobility, being able to make a big play out of nothing, and keeping the play alive is his best trait. When the pocket collapses, Russell Wilson shines. And the Packers defense likes to get after it, and it wouldn't surprise me if he has to get out the pocket and really make a play. And he has two really good wide receivers and a pretty decent tight end in Hollister that can go out there and get the job done as far as getting the ball. And, Marshawn is getting more and more reps. So what does that mean for fantasy players? Who would you want on your roster? Who would I want on my roster? I am a big fan of DK Metcalf. He is becoming more potent as an offensive weapon. As somebody who was drafted, and coming out of the draft, people were saying, oh, he just knows how to run up and down, and is just really fast and really big. He will never make it. And it just seems to me that you can't always trust every evaluation you get on a player. And DK has definitely proven himself to be a quality wide receiver in the NFL and a really big part of the Seattle offense thus far. Him, along paired with Tyler Lockett, they're just two really fast players who can get up there and get the football. And then Hollister is a really nice compliment, as he does a lot of damage in the middle of the field and can catch over these linebackers, and really strong to go against the safeties. I think the key for Seattle is really just trying to get the ball moving down the field, because their defense is it's not in the best shape. Of course, they lost one of their key defensive players right before the season ended, and he's out for the season with a torn ACL. So really, the defense is going to be trying their hardest to keep the game close, but it might be too much dealing with the Green Bay offense, which has been different since Mike McCarthy has left, and Aaron Rodgers has looked different since then. And I don't know if it's strictly because of a different offensive system, but Aaron Rodgers is not the same. They're not asking Aaron Rodgers to do similar things that Aaron Rodgers used to do in the past. So he doesn't have to throw 50 times to get a win anymore. He doesn't have to be Herculean to go win playoff games. At least thus far that we've seen in the regular season, he doesn't have to do it to win games, and they're not going to change from that formula, I would assume, anytime soon, just because you don't need him to do that anymore. He's getting to that point in his career where he's reached the apex of his powers as far as a quarterback. I don't think he'll be better as far as his arm strength will go down. His accuracy will dip at some point. He's just on the decline. It's just a steady decline, and it happens to everybody. Everybody hits the wall at some point. So to mitigate that, you put really good players around them and you give them a good run game, and their run game is really nice. Aaron Jones is a really good running back, especially for fantasy. He gets a lot of good yardage. He gets a lot of good points. He scores a lot. They hand him the ball. They trust him with the ball. And then, of course, you have Jamal Williams, too, who might get some touches as well. So those two backs alone are really, really interesting pickups for fantasy if you want to look into it. Of course, Aaron Jones is the safer pick, but sometimes Aaron Jones has an off day, and Jamal Williams will get in there and do the dirty work, so to speak. Of course, there's Devontae Adams, who is one of the better receivers in the league, but he doesn't get a lot of credit. And I know there was like a big movement to get him more notice, especially when A-Rod was not healthy and he was still putting up numbers. And I don't know if it worked for the grand scheme of things for national media, but as far as if you know football, Devontae Adams is a special player, and he's really, really, really good. So that's one of those stud wide receivers that he's a clear number one. He's going to get a lot of targets, a lot of touches, because there's really nobody else on that offense that you have to worry about receiving wise as far as big name guys. Jimmy Graham is not what he used to be. He can still get there and get touches though. So outside of that, it's really just Aaron Jones and Devontae Adams basically playing football with the rest of everybody else. And everything else is kind of catch and run by committee. So they spread the ball a little bit. Not everybody. There's no real big second wide receiver threat coming out of Green Bay. So Seattle will just have to try and keep up. I think this might be one of the really, really interesting games because Green Bay hasn't really played a good team in a while, and they haven't played their best football yet. And a lot of people have them down in the playoffs in general. They don't think they'll go far. And say if Green Bay had to go to that playoff game instead of New Orleans, they might be home as well. So it's a interesting matchup just to think that Russell Wilson may have to win this game on his own, or by not on his own, but he might have to will this game because we don't know if his defense can help him in this way. Like, their defense has notoriously struggled in the past few weeks just because of the injuries, and they weren't that good to begin with. They've just been kind of scoring really well. Their offense was really good, and then people started to figure them out, and their defense is serviceable, but it's not the best. And can they make big plays and big moments? That's kind of where they're at right now. They're not going to be a shutdown defense. They never were a shutdown defense. They haven't been a shutdown defense in a very long time. So now it's up to that defense to make big time plays at the right moments to get Russell Wilson the ball so that way he gets the ball more often than not. And plus they need to manage time. You don't want to give Aaron Rodgers a lot of time. You don't want to give him the chance to come back and make wins because he's still known to do that and one of the best in the business at being clutch at the right times and knowing when to turn it on when he needs to. That's something Aaron Rodgers just knows when to do and how to do it. So to mitigate that, you don't want to give him that chance. And I'm just interested in the matchup. Green Bay and Seattle has had some really interesting matchups in the past. The controversial catch at the end of that game a few years back when I think that was during the Legion of Boom times. But it'll be interesting to see. I'm excited for all really the playoff matchups. I can't wait to watch them all go down. So we're going to take another quick break and we're going to talk a little bit about Dynasty League stuff as far as quarterbacks go and who are you looking to take in a Dynasty League if you're making one today. That could be coming right up.
Are you looking to get your college football fixed? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Okay, so coming back in, we're going to tap into the Dynasty League settings and we're going to look at what the landscape is for Dynasty League quarterbacks going into this new draft class, just to see what is your choices now. Because I, for one, think that there are some rookies coming into the draft that you may need to replace a player or two. Say if you have like a Phillip Rivers who you are thinking that it's time to move on from, or maybe you got Baker Mayfield and you feel like this isn't the one for you. and you're like one of the bottom half of the leagues. So dynasty leagues are really fun because it's like it simulates the NFL in an interesting way, as you keep all the players you draft in a dynasty league for the most part, unless you let them go, or you keep most of them. It depends on your format, and you draft play. And like really the only time you draft are people who are, I guess, waivers and rookies. So the rookies coming in as far as quarterback. So if you're looking for somebody to quarterback your fantasy football team for the better half of a decade, if you go that long, you have some interesting options. You have, of course, Jalen Hurts is coming out. You have Joe Burrow. You have Tua as well. Justin Herbert. You have some interesting quarterbacks that are coming out into the draft, and you know, looking at it, especially from the top two, which are Tua and Joe Burrow, draft spots don't really matter as far as where they go in NFL. I mean, I guess for what they do and how well will they be well off in those systems. But I just have an interesting idea that maybe, depending on where Tua gets drafted, right, he might be in a better situation overall than somewhere where Joe Burrow is projected to be, which is number 1, to the Cincinnati Bengals, just because the Bengals have a lot more to work on before they really become a decent franchise again. So let's say, I know that Miami is projected to take him at 5, and we're looking at what Miami has looked like in the past few months. And they look like a football team again. Like, I know when they started off, they didn't look too good, and they kind of were on pace for being the worst team in NFL history. But they kind of turned around the ship near the end, and they still got a high draft pick, and they look like a promising franchise that can turn something around and make something out of this. And they got a lot of good picks. They have a lot of first rounders coming in. So it looks like they did a good job doing the strategical tanking. The first time I've really seen it in the NFL, like, NFL doesn't tank very often, or at all really, because you kind of, if you are not good in the NFL, you are not good in the NFL as far as team wise. There's really no need to tank. You're going to try and win the game, but it's just too hard. It's too hard to win in NFL consistently. So if you're not good enough to win consistently, and you're not good enough to win really at all, it will definitely be shown more times than not. So what does that mean? They have Devontae Adams. I'm sorry, not Devontae Adams. They have Devontae Parker, who is a really, really good wide receiver who I think a lot of people slept on for a while, but I don't think his potential, he reached his potential at a certain point, and I still don't think he's reached it now. He did get the new contract, and he looked good coming off of it, which is rare because when guys get new contracts, typically they don't play, so they don't reach the contract potential. There's only been there's been recent cases where that happens to be the case now. Like, so Michael Thomas, who got a really, really big contract, had probably played so good that he might have to get it restructured for more money down the road. I don't know. But other than that, you don't really see too many people play up to the contract that they earned at the time. And I think that if Tua goes there, he has a number 1 wide receiver to work with. They definitely need to look at getting a running back to complement Tua. But if they can do what they did for Lamar on the Ravens in Baltimore, they really might be able to make some noise in the AFC, where it seems like New England right now might not be at the peak of their powers coming soon. And there might be a new renaissance in the AFC coming soon. You know, the Bills are looking to turn things around. The Jets might be able to make a leap next year. There just seems to be a positive spin on this whole AFC division. So what does that mean for your dynasty league? Well, if you're looking for a quarterback that has a lot of promise, Tua might have the most promise in the draft just because he fell only due to the injury, because preseason rankings and before the burrowing happened in college football and the Orgeron LSU led team, he was definitely the number one overall pick projection in college football, right beside Chase Young. So him going to 5, you could argue that's a steal for Miami. And if he is healthy and he's good, then I don't see why you wouldn't try to take a young quarterback that could have a chance to really be in this league and make some noise really early on. And I mean, what do you have left to lose? So say if you have like a Baker Mayfield, right? And Tua isn't what he needs to be just yet. You still have him on the roster. You just keep him. You hold on to him and you just kind of wait it out until the moment arises. So, or, young quarterbacks mature a little bit faster than you would think they do nowadays. Like we saw out of Kyler Murray in Arizona. They put him directly into the system. It wasn't one of those start, wait and sees, wasn't like wait a season then start. Like even Lamar was relatively fast, but he didn't start initially. He waited like 8 games. And those 8 games might have been really important for him to really get accustomed to the whole NFL way of play and things like that. Even Haskins in Washington didn't play right away. Granted, this hasn't worked out for him just yet, but not typically people play right away and be successful. So usually they wait. So you never really know. But I feel like people are rolling the dice with quarterbacks to start them right away anyway, just because the more reps they can get, the better experience they can earn, and the better their team might be able to improve at that point on. So that might be an interesting pickup. And then, of course, coming out of Georgia, their quarterback, who seems to be I feel like he's been a bit slept on. Jake Fromm, he doesn't have the biggest arm, but that doesn't really matter. And, the way he throws the ball looks a bit weird sometimes. Like, you feel like the ball, like the camera is following the trail of the football being thrown a little bit slower. But he's a really smart player and he knows what he's doing. And I think he can translate well, make the best transition into the NFL besides Joe Burrow. I think he might be the easier one to transition into. And whoever decides to draft him really might have a good chance. Like, so say if somebody takes a flyer on him and puts him in the starting lineup, then you just have him stashed away for when that time comes, Or maybe you don't take a quarterback in the first round of your draft, or maybe you just don't take a quarterback at all. There's like plenty of good players coming out. A lot of good wide receivers, of course. Wide receiver talent is really deep this rookie draft. So, the skies are the limit in Dynasty leagues. It's all about how you manage your players and trades and future assets. So get to draft and get to scouting just like the rest of us. So we're going to take another quick break and then we're going to come back afterwards and we're going to talk about some of my favorite settings in fantasy football to spice up your leagues. That's coming up.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
All right, so we talked about Dynasty Leagues a little bit earlier, and now we're going to wrap up the podcast talking about my favorite tweaks to Fantasy Leagues, things that make things more interesting, that invite more challenge into your leagues and just make people more competitive and things like that. So one of my favorite things to do nowadays is I have basically tried to remove myself from snake draft leagues for the better part of this new 2020. And I've been doing mock drafts on that kind of stuff. So I find that it's more fun to do auction, and it makes things more competitive, and it makes you value players differently. And it isn't just, oh, this guy luckily got the first pick, so he gets to choose whoever he wants to choose and things like that. So if I want to fight to get, or if I not fight, but if I'm not going to sit here and lose Christian McCaffrey just because a random number generated me to be 6th in the draft, I don't want to do that anymore. Like, that's annoying. I'd rather, it feels worse to me. I think it would feel better to me that I lost in fantasy because I drafted these players and I put the virtual money or the fake money auction wise, the salary cap money to acquire them. And if I lost, I lost. And that's just what it was. I don't want to lose and have a chance to scapegoat why I lost up to the chance of a random number generator putting me 8th in the draft, and I got stuck with a wide receiver that didn't pan out well when you really just wanted to get one of the stud running backs that you knew was going to be able to produce at a high level. So auction drafts are fun, they are competitive, and it shows you who actually enjoys fantasy or not. Or not enjoys, everybody can kind of enjoy fantasy if you play it in a snake draft, but it really shows in the nitty gritty who is really out there to play to win and who knows their stuff. So if you want to test out auction drafts, go ahead and try it out and just see if it's for you or for not. Sometimes it's not for the people that you think it is. Like, you think you might be a competitive guy and you enjoy fantasy that you would enjoy fantasy that way. But sometimes adding the extra point values and stuff might make it a bit more difficult for you to really evaluate draft picks and players and just what you're trying to build your team to become. All right. So the next setting that I enjoy is, scoring settings. So I really like the idea of adding giving quarterbacks more value for certain things. So, I really like giving quarterbacks, like extra points in far as their yardage to gain. Like, so the average quarterback can get upwards to 17 to 20 fantasy points per week. And the upper echelon gets closer to like 26 to 30 and above. So players like Lamar Jackson, Patrick Mahomes, even at some stages of the Carson Wentz era and stuff like that, they can generate points off a whim. So the lower tiered quarterbacks end up kind of being undervalued, and then they go super late in the draft. Some people don't pick quarterbacks till like the last few rounds of the draft, and I think that's kind of weird sometimes, and I would like quarterbacks to be valued a little bit more. So sometimes I add extra incentive bonuses for quarterbacks who are really good, who drop like really good stats, and they can add some extra points that make them more valuable and get them closer to top end players, but not so much to where it devalues top end players, because they obviously will get the bonuses too. So if somebody goes for 3 touchdown games, they get a +3 points to their performance rating, and then you'll see the difference between somebody who is more of a playmaker who gets the ball down the field more often than somebody who game manages and, they get their 250 yards passing and then, one passing TD, aside from somebody who goes out there and may throw for, 300 plus yards and then get 3 TDs. That might get you more points, and you may have to value a quarterback a little bit more than that. Speaking of quarterbacks, another one is the idea of adding a second quarterback position to your starting lineup. And that can or you can have the quarterback flex position, I like to say. Like, you can kind of flex a QB or somebody else into your lineup. That's just, sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't, you know? It just kind of depends on how I'm feeling about the upcoming season and if somebody invites me. Because usually I don't do it, but I like playing in them because it's different and it makes you look at different matchups sometimes. And it kind of helps in certain situations. So say you start one of your quarterbacks that you have sitting on the bench goes off and you could put him in your starting lineup, instead of having just to suffer sitting him on the bench. He's in there and, you know, you get those points when your quarterback number one is not playing his best football. And that's always fun. Of course, IDPs or independent defensive players, individual defensive players, whichever one you choose to say. That's an interesting place to be at in fantasy. I played with IDPs for 2 straight years, and I'll be honest, the scoring can get kind of hectic sometimes. If you have you got to make sure your scoring settings are correct, because if you don't, you might get really, really unlucky, and you get some players that only get you about maybe 8 points, and other players get closer to 20 or 30 plus. They can really make some havoc. So you got to make sure your scoring settings are correct. But IDPs add a whole new draft element to your game. For the most part, it makes your draft so much longer, first of all. And then after that, it makes it makes you value what is what. And you never really know until you play in the IDP league what to value from defensive players. So you're just going to end up waiting around to see what other people do and how other people are looking at the draft before you go in there. So if you're interested in IDPs, it can be really fun, and it's definitely a change of pace, and you don't have to suffer as much. So somebody who had the Patriots defense this year was really successful probably, and if you had IDPs, it wouldn't be as strong. So then, of course, there'd be more parity within your fantasy football leagues as far as the defensive end. But you do definitely, I would suggest going into some mock drafts if you're going to do that sort of thing, because you just never really know until you go into the draft and see for yourself, and then you play a full season. Don't expect too much, because IDPs can be kind of a mixed bag, and it can be bang or bust majority of the time. I got one more I can think of that really changes the atmosphere. Probably when you mess around with waivers. If you make waiver priority instead of somebody being the worst team in the league, sometimes you do, first come, first serve sort of things. Or the best way to handle waivers, of course, is to have a budget. You have a salary for wagers to where you do silent auctioning on your waiver wire, to where you bid for a player silently. You don't tell anybody, and whoever bids the most, of course, gets that player. So it will no longer be, okay, this guy is, the worst in the league, so he gets first priority on any waivers he decides to pick up. Instead, if you have $100 waiver budget and you are the best player in your league, you could spend your whole budget or 90% of it and you go get that player, and that's it. All you have is $10 left on your budget for the remainder of the season. And that can you got to be really smart with that sort of stuff, and that just adds a different level of gamesmanship and knowledge of how to really manage your money and that sort of stuff. So that's probably one of my favorite ones to do. But that's going to wrap up the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, hosted by the GSMC Podcast Network. Please don't forget to rate and review the podcast. 5 stars, 5 stars. Don't forget to follow us on social media as well. That's our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I've been your host, Ethan Orfe, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Have an excellent football playoff weekend, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.